just want to remind you again, sin, promises, shortcuts are your best choice. The biblical teaching is this: shortcuts are not your best choice. In fact, sin mocks diligent, effective service. Sin just says, listen, why would you do that when you can just have it here? It's every time that's wrong. Every time that's wrong. And here's what I want you to see. Ephesians 4, see it? Do honest work with your hands. There's your work. There's your God-given assignment. So that you can be secure for the rest of your life and you can have a really cool vacation. Okay, that's not what it says. So that, in other words, this is a purpose statement. Here is the purpose of why you worked, that he may have something to share with everyone in need. Well, we are in the midst of a conversation about relationships, and today we're going to talk and continue that discussion about how those relationships work in our work relationships. And so that's where we are this morning. And we will take a look briefly at Colossians chapter 3, a passage you're familiar with. So take your Bibles and turn there. And then we're going to use our Bibles and jump back into Genesis this morning, and then forward into Nehemiah, and then back to Proverbs, okay? So just so you know kind of where you're going. If you're new to the Bible, don't be afraid to use the table of contents in the front. If you don't have a Bible with you, grab one out of the pew and take it home with you. If you don't have one at home, we'd love for you to do that. You won't be stealing, okay? Nobody's going to grab you on the way out and say, put the Bible back, okay? We want you to take your Bible home and we want you to read it. Colossians chapter 3, we have been in this discussion, and this is kind of our launching point this morning, where we look at our work relationships with one another. And we read in verse 22, "Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward." You are serving the Lord Christ. So last week we talked about some general ideas about work, but today we're kind of going to focus in on the employee-employer relationship. And again, we find that throughout the scriptures. But today we just want to look at you as an employee. If you say, well, but I'm an employer, I'll just remind you, even as an employer, you have to give accountability to somebody, okay? You have to give accountability to whether it's a board of directors or some other capacity or your shareholders. All of us are working under some level of authority, and that's going to be our first idea this morning. So we're going to kind of unpack that for a little bit. Realize that we all operate under authority, serve with integrity, humility, and urgency. Then we're going to look at those three words, okay? I know there's a lot more words you could choose for that employee relationship, but I've just kind of centered in on three: integrity, humility, and urgency. Remember that no human authority is perfect. Show the grace towards their imperfections that God has shown towards yours, okay? Now, just read those two statements with me, and then we'll take a look at the first one, okay? As an employee, say this with me: realize that we all operate under authority, serve with integrity, humility, and urgency. And the second one, remember that no human authority is perfect. Show the grace towards their imperfections that God has shown towards yours, okay? So let's take a look at that first idea: integrity, humility, and urgency. Now, for integrity, we're going to look at the life of Joseph, who was an employee, a bondservant of Potiphar, and then went on to become second in charge of the kingdom. But before he ever had that position, he was a bondservant and a slave. Humility is the second idea, and we're going to look at Nehemiah, who also went on to become a great leader in the Old Testament. But before he had that position, he was a cupbearer to the king. And then we're going to look at urgency from the Proverbs just briefly. So let's just take a look at those three ideas together. Now, in Matthew chapter 8, there is a centurion that comes to Jesus. And he makes this statement to Jesus that kind of should remind all of us where we are. He has a servant that is ill, and he wants Jesus to heal that servant. But when he gets there, this is a Roman. This isn't a Jewish individual. He wouldn't have known the Torah. He wouldn't have grown up with the law. But he comes to Jesus, and he says, listen, you don't even need to come out and see my son, because I know you're probably busy. So here, Jesus, here's what I want you to do. Verse 9, he says, "For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. Therefore, just say the word." Okay? When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such a faith." Okay? Now, Jesus says that because the man, the centurion, the one who's in charge, is saying, "I am in charge of soldiers, but you, Jesus, are in charge of everything." See, he says, "You are the ultimate authority." Now, just let me remind you that we all, whatever our work relationship, engage in some level of authority. So let me just ask a question. If you served at some stage in the military, any one of those elements in the military, can you just raise your hand for me real quick, wherever you are? Okay, I'm going to ask you to do something. Come on up here, okay, because we're thankful for your service. Just come on up here, and I want you to get in line. Come on. If you served in the military, come on up. I'm giving a command, okay? Yeah, there, you got it, okay? You got it? Okay, come on up. I'm a civilian, so don't hurt me, all right? Here's what I want you to do. You guys all of you served in different capacities in the military. Work it out among you and put yourself in order of rank. Okay? Just talk to one another, figure it out, and kind of figure out where you go in the rank, figure it out. Okay, now watch this. This is important, okay? And we'll start the highest rank down here to the right to the lowest rank, okay? So find out where you stand, okay? There you go, figure it out. Now watch this. These people don't know some of them probably don't even know anybody that's in their group, okay? But they're figuring out where they should go. Why? Because all of them understand what it's like to be under some capacity of authority, okay? This is great. This should give you a lot of confidence in what's going on in our military around the world, right? These guys could figure it out just in church on a Sunday, and it should make you feel pretty protected when you're here on a Sunday morning too, okay? Now, let me grab a mic real quickly, okay? And you guys did that really, really well. You want to turn this one on for me real quick, guys? So here's what I want you to do. I'm just going to ask you to give your name and your capacity that you served in and the arm of the service that you served in. Go ahead, just pass the mic down. Brandon Newkirk. Do I need to do something here? Let's see. Okay, go ahead, Brandon.
Brandon Newkirk. U.S. Army.
Oh, go back so we can get the guys here at the top. There you go, thank you.
Brandon Newkirk, Major, Army.
Jeff George, Captain, Army.
Greg Gray, First Lieutenant, Army.
Tom Atkinson, Master Sergeant, U.S. Air Force.
Carl Dunlap, Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps.
Lou Fabiani, Staff Sergeant, Delaware Air National Guard.
Phil Curtis, Staff Sergeant, Air Force.
Paul Waller, Second Class Petty Officer, U.S. Navy. John Hudson, Specialist, U.S. Army.
Andrew Shreffler, Corporal, Marine Corps.
Charlton, E2, United States Air Force.
Marco, Private Engineers.
Milton Whitty, U.S. Air Force, 63 to 67. I served a lot. I loaded a lot of bombs and missiles. Was a lowly E4.
Thank you guys and women for your service. Thank you. Okay, yeah, see, look at this. This is great. You guys aren't even going back to your seats unless I give you a command, are you? Okay, go ahead. Here's what I want you to see. Everybody serves in some capacity under authority. If you are an individual who thinks you don't need to serve under authority, then maybe you should have spent some time in the service, okay? All of us serve under authority. And what this centurion says is, I know I have people who serve under me, but ultimately he says, I serve the Lord. Therefore, just say the word and I'll go back, okay? Here's what I want you to see before we go any further, that you just need to figure out where you are in your authority structure, wherever you are at work. Because once you understand that, then you're going to understand how it is that you relate to those individuals who are responsible for you. So let's talk about that in Joseph's life. Go back with me to Genesis chapter 39. Genesis 39. Genesis 39 gives us this wonderful reminder of what it's like to be someone who's serving and who is working for someone, even if you are misaligned, even if you are misrepresented, even if you are lied about, why integrity matters, okay? So I'm going to say of integrity is who you are when no one's watching. And bear in mind, the Bible kind of communicates that when it says, listen, you're just not serving as a man pleaser or as a people pleaser, but you're serving as a God pleaser, because Hebrews reminds us that there is no one who is not under the eyes of the Lord. So integrity is who you are when no one's watching, okay? Integrity is best seen when others around you lack it. Integrity is best seen when others around you lack it. The Society for Human Resource Management found that 53 to 58%, you ready for this? Almost 60% of applicants misrepresent themselves in their resume or in an interview at a job, okay? That's like almost 6 out of 10. That means basically when someone comes and interviews for a job, they're probably going to lie, okay? Not only that, consider this regarding integrity. Shrinkage, that includes the idea of administrative error, but it also includes the idea of shoplifting and employee fraud, cost the global retail economy just a few years ago $128 billion. Okay. In the U.S. alone, it was $42 billion that employees took from their employer. The National Restaurant Association estimates that 7% of their earnings are lost in employee theft. Now, I don't know if that's the money or if that's the food they're eating before they go home, okay? But 7% of what the restaurants make is devoured by the person you're about to tip for lunch this afternoon, okay? So here's the thing I want you to see. Integrity is best seen when others around you lack it. I know that you work in environments that lack integrity. Joseph gives you an incredible picture. Ready for this? Take a look with me at Genesis chapter 39, verse 7. The text says in verse 6, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused, and said to his master's wife, 'Behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge.'" Now watch this. You don't get a chance to really understand Joseph's integrity until you see Potiphar, that's Potiphar is his boss's wife, lack integrity. This is so important. When you go to work tomorrow or Tuesday and you say, "Man, it feels like I'm the only one here that's honest," okay? I want to remind you that is because integrity is best seen when people around you lack integrity. And I know that makes it difficult, right? I know it's easy to kind of do the things that everybody else might be doing, but the Christian isn't supposed to do that, because the Christian is thinking in terms of pleasing the Lord, not simply pleasing men. We do things for the Lord's eye service, not for others. Here's the second idea. Integrity must be guarded. It is the equity from the trust that you have earned. Integrity must be guarded. It is the equity from the trust that you have earned. Now, let me just think with you about that. When you started to pay a mortgage on a home, if that's your situation years ago, eventually you, as you paid, began to own more and more of that home. There is certain equity that exists in our relationships. When you first start to maybe date someone who becomes your spouse later, there isn't a lot of equity in that relationship. You don't know what they're going to think when you say what you say, and they don't know what you're going to think when they say what they say. We don't know where the other person is. But the longer you're married, you kind of understand where that is, and there's a natural equity there. What I want you to see is that integrity absolutely must be guarded. You can't play fast and loose with it, because it is the equity of the trust that you have earned. And Joseph teaches us that in verses 8 and 9. Look, he says, "But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in this house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge.'" Now just think about that for a second. Here is the servant. He is over all the other servants. He was sold as a servant by his brothers. He was sold and sold up here again. But suddenly he is in charge of everything. But notice how he sees a personal accountability because of his sense of responsibility. That's why he has integrity. And look what he goes on to say. "He is not greater in this house. No one in this house is not greater than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife." See how he's reasoning? I cannot violate my employer's trust even if his wife is asking me to sleep with her. Why? Because this is trust, this is equity, this is an issue of integrity. Here's a third idea. Integrity seeks God's approval, not simply man's. It is maintained, that is, the integrity, therefore, is maintained when you're alone. Okay? This is so important. Integrity seeks God's approval, not simply man's. In Genesis 39, all of a sudden you hit this little phrase. He looks at Potiphar's wife and he says, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Now, just for a moment. He is not with his Jewish people. He is up in Egypt that has an entirely different culture, that has an entirely different way of thinking. And Potiphar's wife, all of a sudden, he drops theology on her, okay? This kind of slams the door on the potential of a relationship, you would think. All of a sudden, he brings God into the equation. God comes into the equation because Joseph doesn't evaluate himself in light of all the other relationships around him. He evaluates his relationship with God and therefore makes decisions around him. She wouldn't have called it a great wickedness. She wouldn't have called it a sin against God, but Joseph did, because that's what integrity does. It seeks God's approval, not simply man's. Here's your fourth idea. Integrity, once tested, will be tested again. Integrity, once tested, will be tested again, and probably again and again and again and again. The Bible teaches us that Satan is the father of lies, and therefore this world is going to bring deception. Therefore, once you say the truth the first time, you can think it's over. It's not over. Okay? And I'll show you that in the text. Look at Genesis chapter 39. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? That seems to stop the conversation until the next day. But look at verse 10. And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. Day after day after day after day. Okay. This is remarkable. You would think that once you show integrity, it'll never be tested again. But quite the opposite is true. Once you show integrity, it starts to get tested in other ways, in other places, in other scenarios. One final one. Integrity may mean short-term loss, but it rewards with long-term gain, okay? Integrity may mean short-term loss, but it rewards with long-term gain. Look with me at this text again in Genesis 39. So here's the story for those of you who don't know it. One day, Joseph is working in there, doing his work in Potiphar's house, and the wife comes and she does the same thing again. She asks him to sleep with her, and as he turns to run, she grabs his coat, and his coat comes off, and out of the house he runs, and she screams, listen, Joseph tried to engage himself physically with me, and therefore I have his coat as proof. She lies. She flat out lies. Remember what I said, integrity will be short-term loss but long-term gain? Look at the text. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, that's what Potiphar's wife said, his anger was kindled. Now stop there for a second. A master over a slave in biblical times had complete jurisdiction. He could take the life of the slave because he had ownership of that slave. Okay? Here's a great question. Why does the master not take Joseph's life, but instead throws him in prison? It's a great question. And the answer is because Joseph had a reputation of integrity that caused him, that is Potiphar's wife, to trust Joseph, finish the sentence for me, more than he trusted his, wow. Okay. You can almost hear, it doesn't say why his anger was kindled, but I can guess why it was kindled. It was kindled because he thought, I just lost a great servant. Right? I won't kill him because I know he didn't do this, but I just can't let him stay here because of the accusation my wife made, and so I'm going to put him in prison. And he puts him in prison. And notice this. It's a short-term loss. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison. And the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. Now, Joseph's in prison for 2 years, and at the end of 2 years, he comes out of prison, he interprets a dream, he gives great planning advice, and Pharaoh, not Potiphar, down here, little Potiphar, but Pharaoh, the one who's in charge of the entire land of Egypt, says, I'm going to promote this man to second in charge of the whole nation, okay? He doesn't know any of that's coming when he's in prison, right? He doesn't know that he's about to be promoted for his integrity. All he knows is that he had his integrity and it cost him. Wherever you are in your relationship with your fellow workers or with an employer or as a student with administration or a teacher, here's what I want you to see. It may cost you something on the short term, but it rewards you in the long term. You say, well, no, it hasn't quite rewarded me that way. I'm still in my short-term process. Let me give you one other phrase. Not only did it reward him in his employee status, but 21 does something that, it's one of my favorite verses in this whole story. Because you read throughout the story of Joseph, but the Lord was with Joseph, and he did well. The Lord was with Joseph, and he did well. The Lord was with Joseph, and he did well. But only here do you read, and the Lord was with Joseph and showed him, hesed is the Hebrew word, steadfast love, loving kindness. God met Joseph in prison and comforted him. It's an incredible thought. That tells you that even if you keep your integrity, and even if you take short-term loss, and even if you take something that feels like it's longer than short-term loss, God intends to comfort you there. And God not only gave him steadfast love, that's the kind of love that comes only from God, but he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And guess what happened? He began to be promoted again and again and again and again. Why? Because Joseph understood that integrity meant that even though it might cost him short-term, it had long-term gain. You got to think about it. It may cost you short-term, but it has long-term gain. Let's talk about humility. Take your Bibles and jump with me to the book of Nehemiah. So as an employee or in your work relationships, whatever that might be, you want to exercise integrity, and you also want to exercise humility. That's a little tough in our world where everyone seems to kind of toot their own horn and build themselves up, and you kind of think you might be getting passed by, okay? But Nehemiah teaches us the idea of humility. Nehemiah, fast forwarding the tape, Joseph was living around 1700 BC, Nehemiah is around 500 BC, so these guys they lived a long time ago, like almost 4,000 years ago in some cases. But here's the thing you want to know, that in spite of all that time that has passed, the same principles apply in God's word. Here we go. Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the king. Now, let me explain that briefly. That meant that he also was a trusted individual. By the way, Nehemiah was Jewish, but the king we're talking about here was Babylonian. That's 600 miles away from where he was in Israel. You may remember that the Babylonians came down and took the nation of Israel, and they carted off the people as slaves. Now, stop there, because I got to put a quick caveat here. If you're saying, why does the Bible talk about slavery when slavery is wrong, okay? Why doesn't the Bible just overturn slavery? Here is why. Because the Bible's written as a piece in history. And most of the time in biblical history, slaves were not about race. They weren't about that element. They were about captives of war. Your country went to war, and they captured that nation, and they brought that nation back and made them slaves. Okay? There is not a means or way to necessarily overturn that process if your nation lost. So the New Testament writers address slavery by saying, here's how you need to respond when you're in it. By the way, Nehemiah was one of those. He was a slave, captured, his families were captured over in Israel. He was brought to the land of Babylon. There he is serving a king. Okay, you with me? He's serving a king, basically as a slave. You say, what's a cupbearer? Does he just bring the food out to the guy? Like, is he a waiter or a waitress? No. The cupbearer was someone who tested the food before the king ate it. Now, that's not a really, you might think, well, that sounds great. You always get a chance to eat the best food, right? You do, until it's poisoned, and then you die, and then they get another cupbearer, okay? So the reason the cupbearer was involved was that he would taste it first, because the quickest way to knock off a king who had a big army wasn't to get a bigger army. It's just to drop a little arsenic or something in his food or in his wine. And when he drinks it, he's gone, and now you can be the king, okay? So that's how the process worked. Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the king, but that wasn't just looking for people to test it. The cupbearer had a unique role here, and he was trusted by the king, and he was looked upon by the king, and sometimes he even counseled the king. So Nehemiah's got a unique position. Here's what happens. Nehemiah gets news over here 600 miles away that his city, particularly Jerusalem in Israel, is totally destroyed. The city that had walls built around it for protection, those walls are now destroyed and the gates are burned, and so people just run in and out of the city, and they take what belongs to the Israelites and they take it out, and they abuse the people that are in the city. So this breaks Nehemiah's heart, and we read in verse 4, Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 4. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your ears open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night. This is great. Nehemiah says, listen, Lord, I understand that getting those walls rebuilt is probably a bigger task than me. So rather than just come up with great ideas and great plans and use my charisma to get it done, I'm going to pause and I'm going to pray. And basically all of Nehemiah chapter 1 is Nehemiah's prayer, saying, I recognize that a God-sized task cannot be accomplished with man-sized abilities. Therefore, I understand who I am. I'm not going to be puffed up with pride. When someone says, you did a great job, I'm going to say instead, listen, if people are watching, I just want to know that the Lord did this thing. Right? Humility recognizes God-sized tasks cannot be accomplished with man-sized abilities. Therefore, Nehemiah prays. Humility understands the importance of planning. You can't inspire others with self-promotion. Look with me at Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 12. Fast forwarding the tape, Nehemiah goes to the king. The king says, why are you sad? That could bring about Nehemiah's execution. Nehemiah says, I prayed quick and I said, okay, Lord, here it is. This is my opportunity. And I told the king what had happened in my city in Jerusalem. Now, that's a different country, far, far away. But this king says, hey, I'm going to help you out. Why don't you go back and build a wall? Because we don't have any money. Okay, I'm going to write you a check, a blank check. Okay, like, think about this. The king over all of the civilized world known at the time just gave you a blank check, and now you're going back to Jerusalem on sabbatical to rebuild the wall. Wouldn't one of the first things, this is one of the first things I do, I'd start waving that check, okay? I'd say, hey, we're going to rebuild the wall. Look at me. I got this blank check, okay? Where are we eating tonight? Okay, the king gave me a blank check. I can do whatever I want, okay? That's not what Nehemiah does. Look with me in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 12. So I went to Jerusalem, verse 11. That's where we'll pick it up. And was there 3 days. He's there 3 days, and still nobody knows what he's there for. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. I went out by the night of by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate. He's going around the city, seeing how bad it is. And I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. He says, I have a plan in my head that God gave me, and I'm not even telling anybody about it. I'm not promoting it. I'm simply inspecting and beginning to plan. Humility acknowledges the necessity of others' help. It's inviting, not divisive. If you struggle in your work relationship because it seems like you're always fighting there, you just need to pause. I recognize it may be difficult, but you ought to pause and ask, how much of that is you? Right? Because look at Nehemiah's position. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 17. Then I said to them, this is the people of Jerusalem, you see the trouble we're in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with gates burned? All of that they knew. Come, let us build. See what he just did? He doesn't say, why don't you build? Second person. He says, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. What Nehemiah just did was he said, listen, I can't do this without you. I'm not going to claim that I can do it. I'm not even going to claim that I got the plan. I'm just going to say, listen, let us build a wall. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for my good, and also the words that the king had spoken to me. Now he says them, see? But see how he couched it in, God is with me, therefore I think we can do this. And they said, let us rise up and build. Notice how they said, let us. They didn't say, we got it. Nehemiah invited, he didn't divide. And he waited, and they accepted the offer. Nehemiah chapter 3 is all about how those people line up around the wall and how they start to build. And there's conflicts, and there's difficulties, and there's challenges. But here's the good news, they build a wall. Humility will always give God the glory. It isn't concerned with recognition. If you find yourself at work concerned about the fact that you're not getting enough status, I just want to remind you that's not where humility is. A great employee is one who is walking in humility, will give God the glory, and isn't concerned with the recognition. Let me show you that in Nehemiah chapter 6. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. Okay, pause and think about this for a second. This wall has not been rebuilt in like 70 years, okay? Maybe even a little bit more than that. It has been a long time since this wall has been rebuilt, and Nehemiah rebuilds it in 52 days? Okay. I just think you almost picture that Nehemiah is saying, hey, I'm going to write about this story in the Jerusalem Times, and then I'm going to write my book, and I'll have a book signing this afternoon, okay? You see none of that. Instead, when all the enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Humility always gives God the glory. Let me talk with you about one more word. It's the word urgency. Urgency. Urgency is doing your work in a timely manner, okay? Integrity means who you are when no one's watching. Humility means who you are when they are watching, okay? Urgency says you're going to do what you do in a timely manner. Urgency understands that if you do nothing today, something happens to tomorrow, okay? I know that sounds like a little mysterious. Like, what do you mean if you do nothing today, something happens to tomorrow? Let me show you that out of Proverbs 24. The writer says, I passed by the field of the sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense, and behold, it was all overgrown with thorns, and the ground was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. Okay? Here is a man who didn't take care of what he had, and something happened to tomorrow. It all fell apart. If you do not do your work today, something will happen to tomorrow. Okay? It will continue to degenerate. The things that you needed to get done won't get done. Things will fall apart. In fact, not only was it overgrown with thorns, but the ground was covered with nettles. I don't know, this is a South Jersey thing, but you don't live up in North Jersey, you live in South Jersey. Have any of you ever been stuck with a nettle? You know what that feels like, right? Okay, that's like the weed that kind of sticks. It's not like a thorn that you pull out and stops hurting. It hurts, and it hurts, and it hurts, and it hurts. It keeps hurting. In other words, now to get back and rebuild this vineyard, remanage this vineyard, you're going to have to clear all of this stuff out that's fallen apart. Because if you don't do your work today, something happens to tomorrow. It deteriorates. It becomes more difficult on the next day. And note this other idea. Urgency at work means that your time is not your own. You are in the service of another. When you go to work tomorrow morning, whoever you're working for, your time isn't yours. You're in the service of someone else. You're in the service of the one you're working for. And note this, you can see this in the sluggard again, verse 32. Then I saw it and considered it. I looked and received instruction. What he's saying is, I looked at the vineyard that had fallen down, and I thought about the person who owned it. And I remembered a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber and want like an armed man. If you do not bring a level of urgency to your work to get it done today, this becomes your future. Okay? You're there as a servant to the one who owns the vineyard. You're not there as the owner. You're there as the one who serves. Therefore, it is your responsibility and my responsibility to make the other person successful, not our own success. And I saw it and considered it. I looked and received instruction. Let me give you one more phrase, and then we're done. Found over in Matthew chapter 5. You say, Phil, all of that's important. Integrity, urgency, and I just lost the other word. Integrity, urgency, and humility. But with all of that being important, you don't know who I work for. If you knew who I worked for, you would understand why it's really hard to do those things. I didn't say it was easy to do the things. But can I remind you that we remember that no human authority is perfect, so show the grace towards their imperfections that God has shown towards yours. Okay? Let me see if I can communicate that another way. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said this, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That is kind of a establishment of, listen, if you did something, it's going to cost you exactly what you did. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now let me stop right there and add this thought for you, okay? Here's what I want you to see. This is not talking about physical abuse. The Bible over and over again condemns that kind of thing. So if you're a wife in a relationship today and you're sitting there saying, wow, that's not helping me at all, I just want to remind you, that's not what it's talking about. Let me see if I can communicate that. Ken, can you come up here for me real quick? Okay. Now, notice what the text says. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Okay, so just stand here. You're smiling like you're trusting your pastor, okay?
Waiting for it.
That's okay, good. I got some equity here, so I think I'm okay. All right. Here's what I want you to see. Point to your right cheek, okay? But I'm right-handed, okay? How do I hit him on the right cheek? Unless I hit him like this, right? With the back of my hand on the right cheek. This is a metaphor for what is a verbal insult, okay? Like it's not simply me punching the living daylights out of Ken, okay? It's me giving a verbal insult, okay? Now, Ken, has anyone ever given you a verbal insult before? Yes. Okay, yes, okay. Did you ever have a tendency to want to give them a verbal insult back?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. I want to ask you if you did or not, okay? This isn't a confession in front of everybody, but here's the thing. Whenever we receive a verbal insult, what is our tendency? Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah? Well, I got one for you, okay? Hear it? You can hear it, right? What the scripture is saying is even if someone verbally insulted you, you are not to respond in like manner. Now, you say, wait a minute, Phil, what about verbal abuse? Okay. There are certain patterns that are allowed for you within the scriptures. The church, Matthew 18, the government, Romans 13, all of those are available to a person. But what we're not permitted to do is get in a, you can go for my right cheek. Yep, here you go. Here you go. Here you go. Here you go. See, this is going nowhere, right? Okay? That's the picture. That's what I want you to see. Thanks. Great job. Here's what you also want to recognize. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. In other words, go above and beyond here. Here's one of my favorite ones. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. You say, what is that? Like, what is this, a tri-club or something? No, it's not. It's a Roman soldier who would have been your authority, even though you were in Jerusalem or Israel at the time that Jesus was communicating this. He would have been your authority, and he had the right, as a Roman soldier, to say, this pack is really heavy. Why don't you carry it for a mile? At the end of the mile, you had the right to drop it. Okay? You had the right to say, I fulfilled my duty. Get somebody else to carry your pack. Okay? What Jesus says. When they ask you to do the one thing that's required, why don't you go a second mile on your own? Wow. Who wouldn't love to have somebody work for them that was like that, right? Who didn't return verbal insults for verbal insults, but actually went twice the distance that was required of them. What I want you to see is even if it had been a Roman soldier who had the right to arrest you and do all those other kinds of things to you, you still had the opportunity to go the extra mile. It's beautiful. It's this great reminder to us that remember that no human authority is perfect. This is how you do it. Show the grace towards their imperfections that God has shown towards yours. Recognize that Roman soldier, when he made that demand, or the person giving you a verbal insult, whatever that might be, whatever it was that's troubling you, understand that you should expect those authorities to be imperfect because you're imperfect, right? You're imperfect too. And yet, God showed you grace. It's a great reminder. These things work in all our relationships. We all operate under authority, serve with integrity, humility, urgency. Remember that no human authority is perfect. Show the grace towards their imperfections that God has shown towards yours.